Theodore and Pugwash the mini-sub were going for a cruise together before dock time one night. "Theodore, do you think we'll ever get to go out on the ocean?" said Pugwash. "Maybe. One day," said Theodore, "when I'm an ocean tug. And I'm a great undersea explorer," added Pugwash. "We'll have fantastic adventures together." They were just passing Lily the lighthouse on their way back when Pugwash dived deep. Then she popped up again in another part of the harbor. "Why did you do that?" Theodore called, moving over to Pugwash. "Oh, I don't like lighthouses," explained Pugwash, kind of sheepishly. "Why not?" Theodore wanted to know. "First, they shine their light," explained Pugwash. "And then they blow their foghorn. It's a very scary sound." "I thought undersea explorers aren't afraid of anything," smiled Theodore. "Oh, I know that," said Pugwash. But she couldn't stop a little shiver running down her hull when she heard that foghorn again. The following morning, Stewiacke took Pugwash to the shoreline outside the Big Harbour. Pugwash was going to take underwater pictures. "Remember that Ekum-Seekum Circle isn't far from here," said Stewiacke. "Stay close." "I know," said Pugwash. You see, some said Ekum-Seekum Circle was a place where ships sometimes got lost forever. "Diving," announced Pugwash. Time passed quickly that day. Pugwash cruised along, taking pictures of the underwater rocks along the coast. Soon, it was time for her to come up again. But Pugwash was in for an awful surprise. She broke through the surface and saw Lunenburg Lighthouse. Lunenburg was shining her light, but Pugwash just knew what was coming next. "Foghorn!" she shuddered and dived again. As deep as she could go. Back in the Big Harbour, Theodore returned from work to find a dispatcher talking to Emily in an urgent voice. "Stewiacke has reported that Pugwash is missing," he said. "I would like you to help find her." "I want to go too," Theodore said right away. "This is a job for an ocean tug," the dispatcher told him. "You just don't know the area outside the harbor well enough, Theodore." "But I know Pugwash," said Theodore in a firm voice. "He does spend more time with her than anyone else," said Emily. The dispatcher was thoughtful for a moment. "Very well, Theodore," he said. "But remember, Constance will be in charge out there." Meanwhile, Pugwash had found the entrance to an underwater cave. "I'll be safe from that lighthouse in here," she told herself. Pugwash slowly entered the cave. Then she thought she heard voices. She turned and got a fright. 3 rocks were staring at her. "Who? What are you?" she stammered. Lo and behold, the rocks began to speak. "Harum scarum, shockum freakum. We're the rhyming rocks of Ekum-Seekum." Added the 3rd rock. And that's when Pugwash knew she had dived straight into the terrible Ekum-Seekum Circle, where ships sometimes got lost forever. Pugwash began to back out of the cave, and the rocks began to talk again. Fold 'em, sub or mouse. She'll come back fast when she beholds that lighthouse. And that scary foghorn, added the 3rd rock. How do they know I'm scared of that sound? Pugwash thought to herself. Then, maybe the rocks were right. How could she go back up there? Pugwash decided to try to find another way out of the cave. She floated on through the cavern. And found another opening. But as soon as she was poking her nose out, a great light from above made her gasp out loud. Right away, she was sure what the light was. A monster lighthouse waiting for her up there. And if it was a monster lighthouse, she knew what was coming next. The biggest, loudest, scariest foghorn in the whole wide, wet ocean. At that very moment, Theodore and Emily were arriving at Shipwreck Rock. They could see Constance, the Coast Guard ship, and Stewiacke by the light of the big, bright, full moon beaming down on the water. Theodore, called Constance, stay close to the shore and out of the way. Emily, you come with me. I know I can help find Pugwash, Theodore said softly. But no one else believes I can. Theodore was floating towards the shore when Lunenburg's light hit his face. Lighthouse, he said to himself. Foghorn, he added. Suddenly, Theodore had an idea where Pugwash was, but Constance had told him to stay close to the shore. Oh, what should I do? He tried to decide. Constance was leading the search team, shining her powerful searchlight at the water. There's only a cave down there, said Northumberland, rising to the surface. The submarine was helping look for Pugwash, too. It was too small for me to go inside, added Northumberland, but I didn't see Pugwash anywhere. Turn off that light, a voice called out. It was Theodore. You're scaring Pugwash, he added. Theodore, what are you talking about? Said Constance. Pugwash is afraid of lighthouses, Theodore said quickly, especially foghorns. Theodore, we don't know what you're talking about, said Emily. She always dives when she sees a lighthouse, Theodore replied. She won't come up because she thinks Constance's searchlight shining down on her is a lighthouse too. Are you sure about this? Said Constance. She always does, repeated Theodore. Very well, said Constance, turning on her searchlight. We'll try this. Everyone held their breath. And then? Nothing. No sign of Pugwash. We'll keep looking my way, said Constance, turning her searchlight on again. We must have missed something the first time. Theodore, it's time you went home. The others began to head off again. I was sure I was right, Theodore said to himself. At least the moon is shining, said Northumberland, beginning to dive again. It's as bright as a lighthouse down there. Lighthouse, repeated Theodore. Wait, he shouted out loud. What is it now, Theodore? Said Constance. Pugwash is down there. She won't come up because she's afraid of the light from the moon. I thought you said she was afraid of the lighthouse, said Constance, beginning to lose her temper. Or was it my searchlight? Well, which is it, Theodore? From under the water, continued Theodore, she might think the moon is a giant lighthouse shining down on her. What are we going to do? Said Stewiacke. Make the moon go away? Theodore saw that Owen, the giant oil rig, was nearby. That's exactly what we're going to do, he said. We have to move Owen here, now. Theodore, snapped Constance, I've heard just about enough of your wild ideas for one night. We know how to search for someone out here. My friend is down there, said Theodore, with a voice as hard as the steel he was built from. And I'm going to find her. I'll help you, Emily said quietly. I hope you're right about this, Constance said slowly. I hope I'm right too, Theodore thought to himself. Deep down below, Pugwash was still staring at the beam of light. She was sure that with a light that big, there must be a horrible foghorn sound with it. The fear almost froze her where she floated. Far above, Theodore and Emily were using every bit of strength they had to move Owen over Ecum Circle. Here I come to make the moon disappear, hollered Owen in his extra loud voice. Down below, Pugwash saw that the light was going out. Lighthouses don't stop shining their lights, she said to herself. She began to wonder if that bright light really had been a lighthouse. At last, the big oil rig was in position. The tugs had got him between the moon and the water like a giant umbrella. "Turn off your lights," Theodore called. Everyone did what he asked. "No sign of her," said Northumberland. Theodore heard Lunenburg's foghorn in the distance, and he had another idea. Before he could think about what to do, Theodore blew his loudest whistle. In the dark depths, Pugwash heard something. Something familiar. Could it be Theodore's whistle? Or was it those rocks playing tricks on her? Theodore would be trying to find me, she decided. It must be him. And it really is time to be an undersea explorer. "This isn't working," said Constance. "Wait, just a little longer, please," called Theodore. "Look!" cried Northumberland. It was Pugwash. Pugwash was safe. Everyone blew their loudest whistles. "Hooray! Hooray for Pugwash! Hooray for Theodore!" Pugwash and Theodore floated very close to each other. "I knew you'd know how to find me, Theodore," Pugwash said softly. "You're going to make a great ocean tug. And I know you'd be okay, Pugwash," smiled Theodore. "You're already a great undersea explorer." Rough weather was blowing up and down the coast, and a blanket of thick fog hung over the harbor. The dispatcher called all the tugs into the great ocean dock. Theodore was the last to return. He had a very strange look on his face. "Is something the matter, Theodore?" asked Emily. "I think," said Theodore, catching his breath, "I think I saw a ghost." "A ghost?" said Foduck. "What did he look like?" asked Hank. "Tell us, Theodore." "I didn't really see it that well," explained Theodore. "It was out near Shipwreck Rock. I saw a small ship. That is, it looked like a ship, only it was a ghost." "Well, how did you know it was a ghost?" said Hank. "It made a strange sound," said Theodore. "Ding, ding." Hank was so startled he bumped right into George. "I could see right through it," said Theodore. "And it was floating in the air above the water." "There are no such things as ghosts," snorted George. "You probably just saw a big wave from the storm." When the other tugs heard that, they were very relieved. "George is right," said Foduck. "It was just a big wave." "George is always right," added Hank. George felt good. It felt good being the tug who was always right. But Theodore was still upset. "I did see a ghost ship," he said quietly. "I know I did." Just then, the dispatcher turned to George and said, "George, I have reports the storm has blown trees into the water near Shipwreck Rock. That could be dangerous for ships. Please proceed there immediately, then report back to me." George headed towards Shipwreck Rock on the edge of the Big Harbour. He was going along slowly, checking for trees in the water. It grew very quiet, except for the sound of the distant foghorn on Willie's Island. What was that? George heard a strange sound, like a small bell. Ding, ding. He floated a little closer. It was a small ship, but not like any ship he had ever seen before. Its mast was cracked and crooked, and its hull was rotten and rusty. George thought he could see right through it. But the strangest thing of all was that but the ship seemed to be floating in the air above the water. And it seemed to be calling to him. "Ghost!" cried George. "Ghost!" And he turned and headed for home as fast as his engine would take him. The dispatcher wanted to send the tugs out to work again, but he was waiting to hear from George to see if the harbor was safe and clear of dangerous trees. George hurried towards the dock, looking very worried. "You look like you've seen a ghost," grinned Emily. The other tugs all smiled, too. All except for Theodore. Theodore knew he had seen a ghost out there.
"George," said the dispatcher, "is the harbor safe? Are there any trees in the water?"
Well, George didn't know what to say to the dispatcher. He couldn't say the harbor was safe, not with that ghost out there. But he had said there were no such things as ghosts, and after all, he was the tug who was always right.
"Well, sir,"
George began.
"I'm not sure. I think I'd better have another look at that ghost. I mean, the coast." "Very well, George," said the dispatcher. "This time, I would like Theodore to go with you. Take the salvage barge to collect anything dangerous you find in the water. That is all."
But, stammered George.
"Theodore can't come with me." "Why not?" frowned the dispatcher. Because,
said George.
"Because the harbor is safe. I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon." "George," said the dispatcher, quickly losing his patience. "First, you said you weren't sure if it was safe, and now you say it is. You will leave immediately with Theodore and not waste any more time. That is all."
George set off, feeling miserable. He wished he hadn't been so quick to tell Theodore that he was wrong about the ghost. Then he wouldn't be going out again right now. Out to where George was sure the ghost was waiting for him. George led the way towards Shipwreck Rock, with Theodore pulling Bobby Barge in his salvage crane. It was getting late in the day. The pea-soup fog was hanging even lower over the harbor. "We're almost at Shipwreck Rock," Theodore thought to himself worriedly. "That's where I saw the ghost." George was worried, too.
"I hope I don't see the ghost,"
he thought to himself. And then he had an even worse thought.
"I hope Theodore doesn't see the ghost. I told him there are no such things as ghosts, and I'm the tug who is always right." "Theodore," said George out loud, "you wait here. I'll check to see if the ghost is clear. I mean coast. There may be some big trees in the water that were hit by lightning. I mean lightning."
George headed towards Shipwreck Rock. But as soon as he was out of sight of Theodore, George stopped his engine and just floated silently, listening. Foghorn? Seagull? Waves in the rocks. George was naming all the sounds he heard, all the good old familiar, not a ghost sounds. Meanwhile, Theodore floated along by himself, naming all the things he saw, all the good old, familiar, not a ghost things. Shadows, dock, a scary rock.
"Another foghorn," said George. "Boat whistle. Ghost." "Ghost!" shouted George.
That strange sound belonged to the ghost. George raced to where he had left Theodore. Theodore was nowhere to be found. Then George had a terrible thought. Maybe Theodore saw the ghost. Or maybe the ghost saw Theodore. Suddenly something bumped right into him.
"Oh!"
cried George. Then he saw it was Theodore.
"Where were you?"
asked George.
"I was worried about the ghost,"
admitted Theodore.
"I did see one, even if you don't believe me." "Well, I've inspected everything,"
frowned George.
"and the ghost is clear. I mean, the coast."
"What was that?" said Theodore. There was that strange sound again. Ding, Ding!
And it was much closer now. The tugs realized with a shudder they were almost at Shipwreck Rock. Theodore, said George, looking very unhappy, I have something to tell you. And then, again, there was a strange sound. It was very close now, and it seemed to be calling them.
What were you going to tell me?
Whispered Theodore.
Tell you?
Said George.
You had something to tell me?
Repeated Theodore.
Ghost! Cried George. Ghost! Cried Theodore. Come on, Theodore!
Just then they heard
Theodore! Theodore!
the ghost was calling Theodore.
It knows your name,
Said George.
I know that voice,
Said Theodore. And gathering his courage, he called,
Digby? Is that you?
Yes, it is.
called Digby the cable ship. The ghost's name is Digby? Said George. That's not a very scary name. Theodore remembered Digby. He was an old cable ship who lived near Shipwreck Rock. Just then, the fog lifted a bit, and the tugboats could see that Digby was sitting right up on top of Shipwreck Rock.
So it isn't a ghost,
Said Theodore.
You were right all along, George.
Now, George was about to say that Theodore had been right about the ghost. But now, there was no ghost. That meant George could still be the tug who was always right. So George didn't say anything. Theodore turned to Digby.
Well, how did you get up there?
A big wave washed me up here during the storm.
Explained Digby.
Now I'm stuck.
We thought, Theodore thought, said George, that you were a ghost.
Yes,
Agreed Theodore sadly.
with the fog all around, it looked like you were floating in the air above the water.
Well, I wish I could float in the air.
Groaned Digby.
How will I ever get down from this rock?
Well, Theodore had an idea. It was getting late, and the other tugs were wondering where George and Theodore were. There they are, shouted Fodak. Theodore was pulling Bobby Barge, and right beside him, George was pulling Digby.
Digby the cable ship was stuck on Shipwreck Rock,
Explained George.
and we got him down with the crane. Good work,
Said the dispatcher.
we were getting worried about you. In fact, we had almost given up the ghost.
Theodore had a very sad look on his face.
George was right, he said. There really was no ghost. It was just Digby.
George could see how upset his friend Theodore was, and suddenly he knew he had something to say. He took a deep breath,
I thought there was a ghost, too.
said George.
When I was out near Shipwreck Rock,
He began.
the sky was filled with big, dark clouds. When suddenly, I heard a strange sound.
Sound?
Chattered Hank.
What kind of sound?
Ding, ding.
Shouted George. Hank was so startled, he bumped right into Emily. The other tugs had to laugh. George told everyone the rest of his ghost story, which really wasn't a ghost story. And do you know something? George found out it didn't feel so bad being the tug who was sometimes wrong. Not so bad at all.